Music theory, using OneNote, looking at the mode's absolute unchanging numbering system. So get ready and some coffee, because although we're just playing with OneNote, it's a beautiful note. Here we are in OneNote. You're not required to, but if you have access and would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of the Modal Node System, MNS System Presentation 1117 Excel Modes Absolute Numbering System. One of only 2 presentations thus far, but we plan on adding plenty more shortly. Also note that we're calling it Excel in the title because this presentation ties into another presentation where we actually build these tables out in Excel, where we're going to spend more time on just building the tables and using some Excel formatting and jargon, whereas here we'll be able to spend all of our time just talking about the concepts. However, I highly recommend, whether you're a music major, just someone that wants to learn music, or someone that wants to learn Excel, to build tables. They're perfect for just practicing Excel. Music is, by the way. And they're also really helpful for us to be able to visualize things. We're gonna have to, in music, visualize things in our mind. Visualize tables. You're gonna have the problem visually. What do you want on the x-axis? What do you want on the y-axis? Many people that use an instrument visualize, of course, the instrument, which is great, like a fretboard or a keyboard. Those are also great things that you can work on your visualization with, not just by handling the instrument, but by recreating the instrument in a spreadsheet. So we also going to use this possibly as a resource that's not in Excel, because some people have an aversion to Excel, even when they're not building in Excel, which is something we really need to work on. Some exposure therapy, I think, would be really useful for a lot of people. But I'm not. This is not medical advice here, so I don't want to. Take it with a grain of salt. Don't sue me or anything for traumatizing anyone. So, okay. Anyways, let's get to our general idea. Is that we would like to learn a system that's going to open up the fretboard as easily as possible. If we look at the fretboard, these are all the notes that are in the key of C and the related diatonic modes. The argument is, what should we spend most of our time learning? Should it be the notes? I'm saying why? No, I'm saying why? Because if you learn the notes, you will be able to play in one key, but it's not transferable to playing from the key of C and related notes to the key of C sharp or D or E. It's not movable. What about if I learn relative positions, scale shapes? And this is going to be a numbering system, often based on the major scale, but using each of the modes, major, minor, Dorian, as the one. That's maneuverable up and down the fretboard. However, it messes up the numbering system within the modes, within the same shape. When I go from the major scale to the minor scale, I end up with different numbering systems. That's a problem. What do you want to learn? You want to learn the numbering systems that don't change, which I would call modal points. Now, I want to point out at this time that this is clear in some systems, and some people I've gotten some comments saying, well, you're just doing the caged system as though it's a whole new thing, or you're just doing like the Nashville numbering system as though it's a whole new thing or something, or like trying to take credit for the Nashville. Look, I think that the caged system and breaking the guitar into 5 components and memorizing those shapes is beautiful. I'm happy to be associated with it. Great thing to do. I think the Nashville numbering system is great, right? That's going to be the idea, that you're going to have a permanent numbering system based on the modes. That's in part exactly what I'm doing here. I'm happy to be associated with that. I think they're doing it the right way. What I would like to add here is the problem that I see oftentimes is when people present something like the cage system or the Nashville numbering system, they present it, or it's thought of in some circles, as like a hack. Like you're doing a shortcut. You're kind of cheating the system. And there's something kind of cool about that too. You're like, I'm doing the easy way. I know some inside knowledge that you don't know. I'm doing it the easy way. And that's kind of cool. And to some degree, that's the case. But I want to propose the idea here that no, the Nashville people, as well as the caged people, are doing it the more sophisticated way, the cleaner way, the leaner and meaner way, than the traditional naming system. They're actually doing it the right way. They're removing the clutter. They're getting rid of the bureaucracy. They're making it, that's the clean way to see it, right? But it doesn't advance. We don't follow it. I'm going to follow the logic all the way through. Why doesn't the logic follow all the way through? Because the naming system is going to cause us a hurdle. Because when we get to the naming system of chords, if you name the chord the 1, 4, 5, if I'm in the key of C and I name the chord the 1, and then I say this is the 5, I can build then a chord off it. But what happens when I build the chord off of it? That means on the 1, it's going to be a major chord. But on the 5, what are you going to call that chord? You're going to have to call it a major chord when you're talking to people, right? And so the language that we're using, we're not going to call it a 5 chord. We could in Nashville music, right? But when you actually write, how do you build the chord? Well, you build the chord by taking the 1, 3, 5 of the scale. Okay, well, what did you just say there? You said you took the 1, 3, 5 of the scale, but I don't want to change it from the 5 using Nashville music system, which I would call equivalent to Mixolydian point, right? I don't want to change it from the 5, and you just told me that I have to build a chord off of it by calling it a 1, 4, 5. What am I going to call the chord name? I'm going to call it a G major. Well, now you just told me that it's not even a Mixolydian at all, right? Now we're going to call it as though it's a major, a G major. It's not a different position. See, the naming system forces us out of the clear logic, the clean way to see it. The shortcut is the clean way to see it. The Nashville music people are right? So we want to follow. So what I want to do is kind of follow the logic through, and I just want to emphasize the idea here that the system that we have for writing it down is the bloated bureaucratic system. That's like we want to learn both languages. Like if you're in Washington, I want to be able to go to Washington. I want to be able to jump through the hoops. I want to play the bureaucratic games, even though they waste so much time, and write it down in the jargon, whatever jargon that they want, even though it's such a waste of time. And then I want to go back to the private sector and do it the right way, which is the Nashville music system, the clean way, the way that actually works, right? So I have to do what I got to do when I go to deal with the bureaucracy, when you write the thing down. And then when I'm actually composing, when actually learning stuff, I'm going to do it in the private sector the way normal people would do it if they weren't dealing with craziness, right? So I'm happy to call it Nashville numbering system if those guys are right? The Cage system is right. It's just that what I'm going to keep on doing is try to follow the logic through so that we see the full logic. That will allow us to learn it in the cleanest way possible and allow us a bridge to see the numbering system so I can easily go back and forth communicating with people on a Nashville music system, but also go to Washington and deal with those sons of, and whatever hoops we got to jump through so we can continue with our business on the private sector where we do things the right way. Okay, so let's go back on over here. And then first, let's just do a quick recap of our building blocks. So I'm thinking about this as a system now, right? So what is the system built off of? We're going to build off of something, and we have 12 notes. So we've made the 12 notes. That's it. So I want to think of it as cleanly as possible as simply 12 notes. Remembering that when I go to Washington, when I get the bureaucratic system in there, then you're going to have these sharps and flats, and they're going to start using names that don't make any sense. Like, well, there's a natural half step, and there's natural notes and unnatural notes and this and that, which is all, from a theory standpoint, nonsense, complete nonsense, right? But we have to deal with it. So I want to see the clean way of seeing it, the way the computer does it, right? The way the computer says, hey, look, if you want me to do it, then you have to give me stuff that's not bureaucratic jargon. Strip it down to the actual information and remove all the nonsense, right? That's what we want to do mentally so that we can work with it as well. And then we convert that. So I can repeat that. I can see that as a repeating thing or as a circular thing, remembering that we basically have 12 notes that repeat around in a circle, or we can think of it as an infinite timeline that's going to keep repeating but have an octave higher going down. When I write the letters down, I'm going to try to tie out the letters. I'm going to use a 1 for A. I used a 1 instead of a 0 if for the programmers out there. because I think it's easier to remember, and I don't see anything that holds me up from what I'm trying to do as we map this out. And I'll map it all the way out to intervals and to chord naming conventions. But that means that we have then this in between, which again they call, a weird note, an unnatural note. It's not an unnatural note. It's the same half step away of every other note when you look at it from just a normal measuring system. And I'm not going to call it an A sharp or a B flat because that's too difficult to remember. If I'm trying to remember it, I'll say that if I'm talking to someone in Washington, I'll say, okay, yeah, it's an A sharp and it's a B flat, whatever. But I'm going to think about it as an A, B or a 2, okay? Because it's cleaner, all right? And then we're going to keep on going. So then you got the B and then you got the C. And now they say there's a natural half step. You can call it, if you're in Washington, they call it a natural half step. It's like, okay, it's a natural half step, but it's not really. It's just going from 3 to 4. It's the same distance. There's nothing naturally different between the distance between a 3 and a 4 and a 2 and a 3. But okay, I see what you're saying. I know how the bureaucracy works. And then we've got a CD, which is a C sharp or a D flat. Okay. And then we've got a D, and then we've got a D sharp or an E flat and an E, and then you got this natural half step, which isn't really a natural half step. It's just because it was based on the major scale. So that's cool, whatever. And then we've got and then we can repeat it. So I want to be able to code switch back and forth between these two, and I want to be able to number this one or say it in my mind as A sharp. If there's two A's next to each other, then what am I going to call it? A B flat. That's how the spelling works, right? So now that we have an alphabet that's overly complex, you have the spelling problem, which basically means that if there's two A's next to each other, I call the one A B flat, right? Or if I'm counting down, I should properly do it by saying B. Don't say ain't. Don't say ain't in Washington. They're going to look at you funny. You say it the right way. You don't say you all in Washington. They're going to treat you bad. So you say, okay, it's not a 2. It's not an AB. When I'm going backwards, we say it's a B flat. It's a B flat, okay? And when I go this way, it's an A sharp. Okay, I could say that. And then if I combine them together, I'm going to call it a 1A. That's what I'm going to put in my worksheets over here, which I have the low E string on top, which I think is the easiest way to see it, right? And so we put the low E string on top because I think visually I've made the argument that's easier to see if I'm trying to map everything out. And I can even see it by just looking at the numbers, which you could call the Nashville music system. Proud to call it that. That's great. But I'm also going to suggest that should be tied to the modes. The modes can be thought of as points, and they could be thought of as the scale. So the modes are the points. That's the key that we want to look. When I memorize the guitar, I want to memorize the shape, caged system, perfect. 5 breakout, 3 note per string, however you want to do it. Do it all those ways, but add to it the Nashville music system, numbering system, which you can also say letter-wise, is basically the modes. That's useful to be able to convert back and forth between the letter and the mode. Why? Because when you name the chords, I'd really like to know what the modal chord is that I'm playing. If I play the 1, 4, 5, the Nashville music system is insinuating that those are different. The 4 and the 5 are different than the 1. And how are they different? You have to say that it's the mode, right? It's a different modal chord. Now, notice that the current system ignores the idea of any other chord. I just want to point this out because this is where we're going. This is the problem we want to kind of address. When you think of playing something off of the Dorian, what do they call it? If I play the Nashville music system off of the 2, I make that like the tonic. Then I build a chord off it. What am I going to call that chord? Well, the current system forces me to say that's a minor chord, right? I don't want to call it a minor chord. It's on the 2. I want to build it off the 2. A minor chord would indicate I'm building it off the 6. You see, the naming convention's forcing me to call it not a Nashville Music Theory 2 chord, but it's forcing me to think of it as a 6. Not only that, but it's forcing me to think of it as though it's a 6, but it's the 1 of the minor scale, because then I have to take the 1, 3, 5, which most people think of as though they're building off of an Aeolian scale. You see, all of that is getting muddied. The chord system throws out all other modes, all other Nashville number positions other than the root and the sixth, the major, the minor, the Aeolian, the Ionian and Aeolian, the 1 and the 6. All the other modes they throw out of the naming convention. That causes a problem when you're trying to use the Nashville numbering system and tell people chords, right? So what we want to do is follow the logic through to bridge the gap and see that clearly, how the language is kind of throwing us off, and then say, how can I deal with that and bridge the gap while I'm doing that, so I can communicate with Washington and do this. So I got these combined together now. So now that they're combined together, then we apply. So remember, this is how you would structurally do it. You don't do it backwards like the way we learn the piano backwards, which isn't a problem just for guitar people. It's a problem for piano people, by the way, too, because we learn the 7 notes before the 12 notes. And that really messes us up, because I want to learn the 12 notes, and then, because that's really the baseline. That's the foundation. The foundation isn't the 7 notes. The foundation is the 12 notes. And then we apply the formula that we're just going to accept a priori, which is going to start on C instead of A. That's just the way they did it, because C became the scale that everybody loves. I love it too. So we got a whole step, half step, whole step, and then you could go to a whole step here, another octave up or around the circle here, right? Whole step, and then half step back to an octave up. So I can visualize it as an infinite, just like a number system going up infinitely, applying that formula over and over, or we can envision it as a circle that goes around infinitely, although the circle doesn't give you the idea of the octaves. In practice, of course, it's the spiral. It has a circular motion and linear motion. So we got C, whole step, half step, whole step, half step. So that's going to be, the formula. Now we apply the modes to it. Now this is the Nashville numbering system, okay? Yeah, that's what we're going to do is give it a numbering system and make those permanent. So that ties in to the Nashville numbering system, although different people seem to explain that a little bit differently depending on who you talk to. So I'm going to try to make it as defined as I can. But all these points, I'm going to name it. I'm going to name it Ionian, Dorian. Then I'm going to give it a numbering system, which will be like the Nashville numbering system. So the D is Dorian. And it's not always a D, but the second position is Dorian, and then Phrygian, and then Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and then Locrian. So we're going to name them seven names. I know those names are ugly, and it's obviously that's why we're going to give it a numbering system to some degree, but it's useful to tie it into the naming convention in some way, because we're going to also want to be building the idea of intervals and chord constructions based on these as the root. Okay, so then I can say, okay, well, if I have that, then we have our notes. These are the notes, the 7 notes in our key, which is C major being a useful key to work with because of the sharps and flats. Now, again, this is a benefit of the problematic system. Like instead of saying all the notes are the same, 1 through 12, we picked special key of C, which resulted in these sharps and flats when you play anything other than the key of C and other diatonic modes of it. That gives us a check system, which is nice. So we might as well use that and work things out in the key of C, and then everything is transferable, everything is shiftable from there. So if I pull all these notes in, they're all what they call the natural notes, which again, there's not such thing really as natural, and there's no unnatural notes, but we call them natural notes. So then we could repeat this in the similar fashion. So now you have 2 layers. We've got the layer of notes 1 through 12, and then we built on top of that, we built from that foundation using our formula a 7-note layer, which we can call basically a scale. Now, of course, what would we want to do with that 7-note layer? We want to number them. So now when you number them, you could use Roman numerals, This is a convention which I think was invented by the Nashville guys, because I'm not totally sure on that, but you have a numbering system because the Roman numerals have capital and lowercase Roman numerals. So you can, when you're just learning to play, you can say, well, I'm going to be playing in a major key or any of these keys, and then I want to have the Roman numeral either uppercase or lowercase. That determines if it's going to be a major chord or a minor chord. So that means that this one's going to be the 1, but I'm going to make it a Roman numeral 1. The 2 happens to have a minor chord. We'll talk about chord creation later. So it has a Roman numeral lowercase 2. And then this one has a 3, and it's a Roman numeral lowercase 3. And this one is a 4 because it's, the V is a 5, minus 1 is 4 because it's in front of it. And that's going to be a Roman numeral 4. So you build a major chord off that. And then this one is Roman numeral 5. And so you're going to build off of this G, in this case, a major chord. And then this is Roman numeral 6, which is lowercase. You build a major chord off of these two because these are uppercase. This is a lowercase for the 6. So it's 5 is the V plus 1 because it's on the other side instead of on this side. So you have 6. And then you've got the funny one, which is Roman numeral 7, but I put a dot next to it to indicate that that's the diminished, which sometimes you'll see with a little circle up top. I'm going to try to keep my symbology as clean as possible for entering it as quickly as possible into software. And so, like Excel, because I want to do everything in Excel to the extent that I can, because Excel is the best tool for learning music theory ever. Okay? That's part of one of my videos if you want to look at that one. People have problems with that sometimes. Apparently that's a problematic statement to make in some circles, but it's nonetheless the case. We deal with facts here. That's the truth. So we can then put it in, and then I can give it a abbreviation so I can at least make it a little bit smaller. I'm just going to call it an ion, a door, a free, a lid, a mix, an AO, and a Locrian. Now, notice that within Western music, you've got these modes, but then basically at the time when Western music kind of really took off, they actually we were playing before that, like when you play like folk music, then it was, I think, more in Mixolydian. Mixolydian is a music that's fun to kind of just groove to, just jam to, and as are some of the other modes. But when you're trying to make a dramatic, like something dramatic, like a symphony or an opera, then it leaned towards the Ionian and the Aeolian. And notice that's why they came up with another name, and they basically called the Ionian the major and the Aeolian then the minor. So then that's why we get this idea that there's only major and minor, because they're thinking those are the things that at the time they wanted to build from, and everything else took a back seat. Now, so that means all of the chord naming conventions, all of the interval naming conventions are built as though the modes don't even exist. Like even the Ionian and Aeolian have been renamed to major and minor as though there aren't anything, like the modes have all been removed. And so I think clearly if we were to look at it properly these days, you'd say, no, that's not the way I would want to build it right now. I'd want to say, no, all the modes are connected to each other. They're all the same notes. They all have equal value, at least theoretically. You can say that you prefer Aeolian or Ionian and Aeolian, but they're all going to have kind of equal value in theory. And so that's again part of the problem, because like I say, this is the way we want to see it, this Nashville music numbering system. That's how I want to name things. I want to take it beyond. I want to name the chord a 2 chord. But then what do I call the 2 chord? What do I call it? Well, it's got a little 2. That means it's a minor. It's a minor chord. Well, what is minor? Minor is the Aeolian mode, but it's not the Aeolian mode. It's the Dorian mode. Well, how do you build something off of the 2 chord? Well, you have to think of it as the one. The one of what? The one of a minor chord, because you're building a minor chord, but the minor is an Aeolian. Do you see? Do you see that messes up our whole, not just on the guitar, particularly on the guitar, but also on the piano, and the whole numbering system takes you out of the whole Nashville idea of a numbering system, which is actually the right way to think about it from a logistical, just playing perspective. And it takes you out of the idea of the cage system. The cage system and the Nashville numbering system are the more sophisticated systems. Those are the right systems. What we currently have is dealing with bureaucratic laws that have been built up over time that is not as clean. It's not as lean and mean. It's not as clean, right? You have to deal with that, right? You got to deal with the bureaucracy. So I can deal with it. It won't drive me crazy. It can give me a heart attack. I'm going to die a little early if I got to go to Washington too many times, but I can deal with it. I can deal with it when I need to. So then we have the mode norm. So I'm going to call it then a lowercase number when I start to think about how you might name intervals. Now, again, you might not follow me through the concept of wanting to name intervals. We'll talk more about that later and whatnot. But I think it'd be really good to think about why this would be the logical next step if you were building it from scratch this time, and it will lead into the bridge as to bridging the concepts in your mind so you can have a better conception of it. But in any ways, I would name it just from a letter, a little I, right, and a little d. That you can get that confused with a D note. But I don't think it's too bad because I usually name the notes with a capital. So I can abbreviate this then with the Nashville number system, a Roman numeral 1, if you would like, or I'm going to call it a little I, or just ion. So these are the three ways that you might represent it. I think the fastest way to put it into like a fretboard over here is with this symbol. So I've got the Nashville numbers basically, and I've got then the symbol, which is the lowercase letter of the mode, or at least the symbol of the mode that I've picked here. So, and this is, again, somewhat, I'm going off the tracks, off the beaten path a bit here, but the Lydian, I picked a little y because the L looks like a 1. So I picked a Y. The Mixolydian, I picked an X because we don't want to get it mixed up with the major and minor. So I don't want to use an M. And then the A, I just use a little a, and then the L, and the Locrian, I used an N so that I don't have that problem with the L again, with the justification that the Locrian is crazy. That's the one people don't play as much because it's got the flat 5, so it's backwards. So you play it with the N first. All right, so that's going to be the naming convention, which I highly recommend then memorizing the fretboard in. So memorizing the fretboard by caged system, by Nashville numbering system, and be able to identify possibly by letter or the modes, because the modes are how you can think about the chords in a way that's better or lasts longer than just thinking about like major and minor chords with the Nashville numbering system here. This is a shortcut. This idea of, well, the 1, 4, 5 are major, the 2, 3, 6 is minor. That is a shortcut. Why? Because just like with this numbering system over here, where you have this weird naming convention instead of just naming 12 standard units, you're learning something over here which isn't technically exactly right, and you're going to have to unlearn something. Just like when you say, well, all the natural C is C major is the natural notes, and all the other notes are unnatural, when in reality they're all equally spaced. If you learn this system, you're thinking as though the 1, 4, 5 are all major scales in essence. That's what you're saying, right? You're saying it's the 1, 4, 5 all have major chords. You could think, well, no, I'm saying they have major chords if you think about them as a triad. But that's not what most people will do. They're going to say, well, yeah, the 1, 4, 5 means those are all major chords. What does that lead you to do? That leads you to think that the whole pattern changes when I go from like the 1 off of the C to the G, because now I've made this a major chord, which makes me think it's the 1 of Ionian, of a major. But it's not exactly. It's a 5. The 5 is different. The 5 will create the same first 3 notes as a major chord, but the 5 is the Mixolydian mode. Why is that important? Particularly on the guitar, because the shape that you build around Mixolydian is different, in particular from a scale standpoint. It has a flat 7 in it. And so I think like people that get sophisticated with this numbering system start to, of course, see that. The Nashville numbering system is going to say, well, I recognize that the 5 is not the 1. I just know that the 5 is different. How is it different? Well, you can explain it by saying it's the Mixolydian. You're making a Mixolydian chord. You're not making a major chord, because when you get to the 7, it's different if you're still in the same diatonic shape. It's going to be, it's a Mixolydian chord. So again, in a Nashville system, they're probably going, they might not say that, right? They might just say, well, no, it's the 5. The 5 is the 5. You play the 1, they play the 5. When you get to the 7 of the 5, it's flat. It's like, okay, you see that, and but that's where the naming convention gets mixed up. Why is it flat? Because you play a major chord, but it has a flat 7. Well, what do we want to call that then? I want to call it a Mixolydian chord, right? I want to call it's different because it's a Mixolydian chord. It's off of the 5, which means it's a Mixolydian. See, that's where the communication gets messed up. So then now notice that if you have this kind of naming convention, when we get to chords and intervals, or particularly chords, I have the ability to actually name the chord, which is the root or not. So I could use a capital letter if I built a chord like it's a Dorian chord. It would be kind of cool to say, well, if I'm playing in Dorian, I'm going to make it a capital, because that will show me that that's the chord I'm playing in. And if it just happens to be a chord in a song that is in Dorian, I can make it that's in like something other than Dorian, like an Ionian. I can make it lowercase. I'll talk more about that later. You might be like, I don't want to get into that at all. You're making stuff up. Okay, but that's way down the road. I just want to touch on that now. Here's just the numbers without the Roman numerals. So that's just the Nashville numbers, if you want to call it that. And then you've got both of them together, where I'm going to give it the letter and the number. This is what I would recommend mapping your fretboard out in, as we have done here. So map your fretboard out by the numbers, relative numbers, Nashville numbers, that I've called them absolute modal numbers, the mode numbers, whatever you want to call them, and start to memorize your caged system. Look at all the points in the caged system, memorize them not necessarily by note, although that's useful, but by relative position, or not relative position, absolute numbering system, to the absolute numbering system here. And and if you do that, that is the most transferable thing to do. So then once we do this, notice now you can see it in a circular format here, just like we have with the 12 notes. So we have 7 of those 12 notes are the scale, which I can see in a vertical pattern, repeating infinitely, or I can see it in a circle. So in a circle, we have the 12 notes. So 12 notes around the outside, where we picked every other note. So we've got the C to the D. So whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, half step. I can put that in its own circle now internally. So now I've got a circle inside that just includes those C, D, E, F, G, A, B. And I can give it a numbering system, Nashville numbering system, as well as possibly an absolute symbol or name by absolute mode, if you want to think about it that way, which I recommend does have value, and we will build on. I'll show you why. But trust me, it's going to be, so you got the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. And so that's going to be the numbering system that we have there. Now, I just want to also recognize that when we start to look at distances and naming what we call intervals, this is a precursor. We're not going to get to this in a while, but just notice the problem here. When I say that there's a difference between like notes, like this C and this A, or note 4 and note 1, I can see clearly that if I do subtraction, I have a 3-note distance, right? It goes 1, 2, 3, 3 notes away. So the C is 3 notes away from A. But if I look at this series of numbers, I note that if I go from C to D, for example, there's actually from this standpoint, if you start here, there's 2 half steps up, but here it's the next note. So there's 2 measuring systems that we can use here. And I'm going to introduce the idea how do we deal with this measuring system normally is we name it a scale. We give it a relative position. We call it 1 through 5. And then normally they change the numbering system if you're on Dorian or if I'm on Aeolian, minor scale. This becomes the 1 through 5. What we want to do and what some of the Nashville music people are doing is saying, hey, I'd like you to keep the numbers the same, 1 through 7, and not reshuffle the numbering system. That becomes a problem, however, when we think about intervals, because when we think about intervals, it forces us to make this the 1. So if I'm looking at this interval, like if I'm going from A to B, then normally what I have to do is say, this is normally from a Nashville numbering system, the 6. But if I want to look at the interval from here to here, I have to make it the 1 because the name that is given to it is what I would call a 2-note away major second, right? Because that's the distance between these 2 notes when we just name the distances between the 12 notes. That naming convention messes us up, right? Because it makes me renumber, it makes me deviate from the Nashville number system. It makes me say, well, that's not a 6 anymore. Now it's a 1 because I've now called it a major second. This being a major second, that means that I've just intuitively or maybe unexplicitly, I've called that the 1 then. So I've changed the scale. So that's going to be something that we want to address. I would show that what you could do, of course, what would the normal people do? Like if you're measuring something, you don't have to rename this. It's like the kid. It's like the kid and the basketball hoop. The basketball hoop is 10 feet high. The kid is 3 feet high. If I measure from the top of the kid to the basketball hoop, how high is that? You don't say, well, let me start from measuring from the kid's chin, and his head is now foot number 1, and now it's 8 feet, including his head. The 8 foot away is from his head, if his head is foot 1. No. How should you do it? You should say, no, I don't need to make his head foot 1. His head is still foot 3, and then I measure the distance from his head, right? It's 7 distance from his head, not including his head as though it's a different scale. So you see, that's what's happening here. And so I would introduce the idea that you could use the same kind of step system like half steps and whole steps, what I would call modal half steps and whole steps, meaning how do you make a chord? If I'm making a C chord, I skip every other note. So I go from C to E to G to B. And if I want to keep going, I go to D and then F, right? And so on. But so that I can call that modal whole steps, right? Because I'm going through or the Nashville numbering system whole step. I would call them modal whole step. That's how you build a chord. You take whole steps, right? And then I could say, well, there's a half step. There's going to be half steps. Now, notice that the half steps between certain notes are not the same in total distance, right? And but if I know the node that we're starting on, then I can say, well, the F is going to be 1 modal whole step or 2 modal half steps away from the Dorian or Nashville number system 2 node within the system. Okay, I know I'm getting a little wonky there because we'll talk more about the interval system becomes the problem. That's where the naming convention, that's where the Nashville numbering system clashes with the bureaucratic system. The Nashville numbering system is right. That's the clean way to do it. Let's think it through, follow the logic, and that'll help us understand it better.